Canada Post just announced a record-breaking $1.57 billion loss for 2025, and the federal government had to greenlight an emergency $673 million bailout just to keep the mail running in 2026. This isn't just a big number, it's a flashing red light for an institution facing an existential crisis, according to the C.D. Howe Institute. So, how did a national service that processes billions of letters and parcels end up burning through taxpayer money at this rate? We're going to dig into the real numbers behind Canada Post's financial collapse, the surprising drivers beyond just declining letter mail, and why this bailout is far from a permanent fix. And stick with me, because by the end, you'll see exactly what this means for someone in your situation. The cost to you is bigger than you think. Canada Post just got a $673 million federal bailout to stay afloat, a direct lifeline carried over from a roughly $1 billion government top-up authorized earlier this year. To put that in perspective, the Postal Service reported a staggering $1.57 billion record-breaking loss in 2025, and they've racked up cumulative losses exceeding $3.8 billion since 2018. This isn't just about declining mail volumes anymore. As the C.D. Howe Institute pointed out in June 2026, Canada Post is facing an existential crisis that runs much deeper. This situation matters right now because these aren't just big numbers on a balance sheet, this is taxpayer money funding an organization that's effectively insolvent. We're going to break down the real cost of this bailout, not just to the government, but to you, the Canadian taxpayer, and what it means for Canada Post's business model moving forward. But if mail volume is down, why are the losses so catastrophic? Canada Post isn't just seeing less mail, it's facing an existential crisis, described as effectively insolvent, with its fiscal situation expected to deteriorate rapidly without immediate changes. The term 2026 reality isn't some abstract concept, it's when this insolvency issue is projected to become critical. Think about that. A government institution on the verge of essentially running out of cash within a year. This isn't a problem that can be fixed by simply raising stamp prices. A C.D. Howe Institute report from June 23, 2026, titled Canada Post's Crisis Runs Deeper Than Declining Mail Volumes and Rising Costs, authored by Eric de Lorenzi, really drives this home. He argues that the issues go far beyond what we usually hear about, pointing to systemic challenges that are bleeding the organization dry. For example, in 2023, while Canada Post reported $6.9 billion in total operating revenue, letter mail only accounted for $2.3 billion, or 33%. The rest comes from parcels and direct marketing, which face intense competition. It's a bit like Blockbuster trying to compete with Netflix when they still have to maintain all their physical stores. The lesson here is that fundamental business models can become obsolete, requiring a complete overhaul, not just tweaks. The federal government has already greenlit an additional $673 million for the current fiscal year as of May 8, 2026, just to keep the mail running. This is on top of a roughly $1 billion top-up authorized earlier in the year. That's nearly $1.7 billion in emergency funds in a single year, highlighting the severity. This isn't just about declining mail volumes, it's a multi-billion-dollar black hole. So, where exactly did all that money go? But if mail volume is down, why are the losses so catastrophic? Canada Post isn't just seeing less mail, it's facing an existential crisis, described as effectively insolvent, with its fiscal situation expected to deteriorate rapidly without immediate changes. The term 2026 reality isn't some abstract concept, it's when this insolvency issue is projected to become critical. Think about that. Where did over $3.8 billion actually go? The numbers here are just jaw-dropping, especially for a crown corporation. Canada Post's financial reports paint a stark picture. A record-breaking $1.57 billion loss in 2025, which, according to CBC News on April 20, 2026, nearly doubles the $841 million pre-tax loss reported in 2024. This isn't an isolated incident, it's the seventh consecutive annual deficit. If we rewind a bit, they reported losses before tax of $548 million in 2022 and $748 million in 2023. By Q3 2024, the year-to-date operating loss hit $803 million. Cumulatively, that's roughly $3 billion in losses before tax over just 6 years. Now, layer on the fact that globalnews.ca reported Canada Post is burning through a $1 billion loan and expects to completely run out of cash by the end of the year. The lesson here is that even a monopoly can't outrun fundamental economic shifts if its cost structure isn't aligned with its revenue realities. But how did this multi-billion-dollar black hole open up, and what does it truly mean for the future of mail? But if falling letter mail isn't the whole story, what else is driving Canada Post's deepening fiscal freefall? While letter mail still accounts for a massive 33% of their $6.9 billion in operating revenue from 2023, its volumes are in terminal decline, plummeting from 5.5 billion pieces in 2006 to just 2.4 billion in 2022. Even direct marketing mail, which made up another 14% of revenue, faces an uncertain future as advertisers increasingly pivot to digital campaigns on platforms like Meta and Google. But according to Eric De Lorenzi, a senior policy analyst at the C.D. Howe Institute, the crisis runs deeper than simply declining mail volumes and rising costs. It's about fundamental structural issues that are increasingly unsustainable. Take a typical letter carrier, for instance, earning an average salary of $80,000, often paired with a top-tier defined benefit pension plan. These represent significant, non-negotiable operational expenses at a time when revenues are shrinking dramatically, contributing to the estimated $746 million net loss in 2023. The C.D. Howe report highlights Canada Post's over-reliance on outdated business models and a lack of agility to adapt quickly. Consider the unique and costly obligation to deliver to every single Canadian household, approximately 16.8 million addresses, from the bustling streets of downtown Toronto to the most remote Arctic communities like Grisefjord, all for a uniform price. That's a profound operational challenge that private logistics companies like FedEx or Purolator simply don't face, allowing them to optimize routes for profitability. So, the lesson here is that it's not just about less mail. It's about a business model struggling to adapt to a radically changing world, weighed down by high fixed costs, an expensive labor model, and a universal service mandate established in a different era. But if the problem is this clear, why has it been so hard to fix? So who's truly responsible for this multi-billion-dollar black hole? The answer points to a case study in Canadian dysfunctionality. That's how Les Viner, senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute, described Canada Post's situation, and it really highlights the deeper systemic issues at play. Think about it. The federal government has repeatedly provided what amounts to billion-dollar lifelines. We're talking a green light for $673 million just for the current fiscal year, as of May 8, 2026, carried over from an even larger, roughly $1 billion top-up authorized earlier. Now, on the surface, that sounds like support. But when you look at it, this funding keeps coming without fundamentally solving the problem. It suggests a certain political paralysis, or maybe an unwillingness to make the tough choices required for actual reform. The lack of an updated or reformed mandate for Canada Post is a huge piece of this puzzle. It still operates under principles from a bygone era, principles that made sense when letter mail was king, but just don't fit the digital world. This outdated mandate means Canada Post is trying to adapt to 2026 with a rulebook from 1980. For example, if Canada Post were allowed to fully diversify into, say, more robust logistics for e-commerce, rather than being bound by its traditional services, their revenue streams might look very different. Adding to all of this is what critics call a lack of transparency and accountability. When public funds like these, hundreds of millions of dollars, are funneled into an organization with consistent, record-breaking losses, like the $1.57 billion loss in 2025 that globalnews.ca reported, people have a right to know the long-term strategy. How exactly are these funds being utilized to move Canada Post towards profitability, not just another bailout? Without that clear roadmap, it's hard to see how they're going to break this cycle. The lesson here is that throwing money at a problem without addressing its root causes is a recipe for continued crisis. The federal government's approach has kept Canada Post afloat, but it hasn't fixed the fundamental structural issues. This constant intervention, without clear accountability or a modernized vision, leaves us with a critical question. What happens when the mail stops being delivered altogether? What happens if 55,000 postal workers go on strike nationwide? If immediate changes aren't implemented, Canada Post faces effective insolvency, threatening the very existence of a national mail service. We're talking about a record-breaking $1.57 billion loss in 2025 alone, and globalnews.ca reported on May 8, 2026, that the federal government was already greenlighting another $673 million just to keep them afloat for the current fiscal year. This funding was a rollover from a roughly $1 billion top-up earlier that year. The lesson here is that this cycle of government bailouts is simply unsustainable. For someone living in a rural Canadian town, this isn't just a news headline. Imagine your small business in northern Manitoba, suddenly unable to send or receive critical supplies and invoices. The collapse of Canada Post would impact millions, particularly in remote areas, where alternatives for essential services simply don't exist. Small and medium enterprises, who rely heavily on Canada Post for parcel delivery and direct marketing, would face a severe economic blow. This isn't just about financial numbers, it's about the social fabric. The C.D. Howe Institute, in their June 23, 2026 report Untying the Gordian Knot, Reforming Canada's Postal Market, proposed a path forward. Their solution involves radical restructuring. Eliminating door-to-door delivery, adjusting pricing, and modernizing the service to avoid complete collapse. Without significant reform, the question becomes: how much longer will taxpayers perpetually fund a failing entity? The existential crisis demands an immediate choice, as the CEO put it. It's either radical reform, outright privatization, or the eventual shutdown of a service vital to Canada's infrastructure and identity. The choice is a tough one, but ignoring it only postpones the inevitable. So, what does this all mean for someone relying on Canada Post for everything from business deliveries to passport renewals? The reality is that the financial choices made today, or not made, have direct consequences for every Canadian. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar problem that's not going to fix itself with another $673 million bailout. It requires a fundamental re-evaluation of how a national mail service operates in 2026 and beyond. The lesson here is that without serious reform, the threat of interrupted services and even higher costs becomes very real. Have you ever had a critical package delayed, or worried about your small business if Canada Post services were cut back? Share your experiences and what this potential insolvency means to you in the comments below. For more deep dives into complex financial issues like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you're looking to understand the mechanics behind other struggling crown corporations and what their financial woes mean for your tax dollars, you'll want to watch my breakdown on the future of Via Rail's funding challenges next.